When people hear stakeholder engagement, they sometimes picture a polite meeting where leaders ask for input and then proceed with the same plan anyway. But effective engagement in governance is far more consequential than that. In this episode, we're going to treat stakeholder engagement as a core mechanism that makes governance real by turning it from a central rulebook into a shared ownership system that people across the enterprise feel responsible for. Governance of enterprise IT, GEIT, cannot succeed if it is owned only by one team, because the decisions being governed affect business outcomes, compliance obligations, operational resilience, and data integrity across many groups. When engagement is weak, governance becomes something people comply with only when forced, and then the enterprise returns to inconsistency the moment pressure rises. When engagement is strong, stakeholders help define priorities, accept trade-offs, and support enforcement because they understand the objectives and feel that governance decisions are legitimate. The goal here is to show you how governance engagement works in practice for brand new learners, including who stakeholders are, what shared ownership means, and how leaders build engagement without turning it into endless consensus. By the end, you should be able to explain stakeholder engagement as a governance discipline that improves decision quality, increases adoption, and reduces bypass behavior. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good starting point is defining what a stakeholder is in governance terms, because beginners often think of stakeholders only as executives. A stakeholder is any person or group that is affected by governance decisions, depends on governance outcomes, or has responsibilities that influence whether governance works. That includes business leaders who own outcomes and fund investments, IT leaders who operate systems and deliver change, risk and compliance roles who must ensure obligations are met, security roles who manage exposure and incident readiness, finance roles who manage budgets and benefit realization, and operational teams that rely on stable services to do their work. It also includes external-facing teams like customer support and sales, because governance decisions about reliability and data quality directly affect their ability to serve customers. In large enterprises, stakeholders can also include shared service owners, vendor management roles, and regional leaders who must balance local needs with enterprise standards. The point is that governance affects many groups, and those groups can either support governance or quietly work around it, depending on how engagement is handled. When you define stakeholders broadly, you see why engagement matters. Governance is a system of shared decisions and shared accountability, not a set of instructions from one department. This definition also helps in exam scenarios because stakeholders are often implied rather than named, and recognizing who is affected is a key step in choosing the right governance action. Shared ownership is the central idea in this title, and it means stakeholders see governance outcomes as something they help create and maintain, not something done to them. Shared ownership does not mean everyone has equal authority over every decision, because that would slow the enterprise and dilute accountability. Instead, shared ownership means stakeholders understand the objectives, participate appropriately in decision-making and oversight, and accept responsibility for the parts of governance they influence, such as adopting standards, providing accurate input, and executing remediation actions. It also means stakeholders support governance enforcement by respecting decision rights and by using escalation paths when conflicts arise, rather than bypassing processes for convenience. Shared ownership changes behavior because people protect what they feel they own. When they feel excluded, they are more likely to resist or ignore governance. For beginners, it helps to remember that governance outcomes like value delivery and risk management cannot be achieved by IT alone, because business adoption, process change, and policy compliance are required. Shared ownership makes those dependencies visible by distributing accountability across owners in a deliberate way. This is why stakeholder engagement is not optional. It is how governance becomes integrated into the enterprise's daily behavior. When exam questions mention resistance, bypasses, or inconsistent adherence, lack of shared ownership is often the root cause. Stakeholder engagement improves governance decision quality because it brings necessary information into decisions before the enterprise commits resources. Business stakeholders understand what outcomes matter, what constraints exist, and what trade-offs are acceptable for customers and operations. IT stakeholders understand feasibility, dependencies, and operational implications that business leaders might not see. Risk and compliance stakeholders understand obligations and evidence expectations that can change what is acceptable. Without engagement, decisions are made with incomplete information, and incomplete information leads to surprises, rework, and conflict later. Engagement also improves prioritization because it helps leaders see cross-functional impacts, such as how a change in one area affects customer service, reporting, or compliance. Beginners sometimes assume engagement slows decisions, but engagement can speed decisions by reducing later disagreement and by clarifying expectations early. The key is structured engagement that gathers input efficiently rather than open-ended discussion that never closes. Governance needs stakeholder input to make decisions legitimate and informed, but it also needs clear authority to decide when trade-offs must be made. When engagement is designed well, it becomes a source of clarity rather than delay. To run stakeholder engagement effectively, governance must begin with clarity about objectives and decision boundaries, because engagement without clarity turns into unfocused debate. Stakeholders need to know what governance is trying to achieve, such as alignment to strategy, measurable benefit delivery, managed risk, and consistent controls. They also need to know what types of decisions are being made and what authority exists, so input can be directed to the right questions. For example, if a governance forum is deciding investment priorities, stakeholders should provide input about expected value, risk, dependencies, and operational readiness, not arguments about personal preference. If the forum is evaluating an exception to an architectural standard, stakeholders should provide input about business necessity, risk impact, and remediation expectations, not broad debates about whether standards are good. Clear boundaries also protect engagement from becoming performative because stakeholders can see how their input will be used. Beginners sometimes think engagement means asking everyone for opinions about everything, but mature governance engagement is targeted. You engage the right stakeholders for the decision at hand, and you use their input to improve decision quality. This targeted approach also supports fairness because stakeholders know when and how they can contribute. When you see exam scenarios about stakeholder conflict, the solution often includes clarifying objectives and boundaries so engagement becomes productive. Another essential element is mapping stakeholder interests and impacts, because engagement should reflect who is affected by a decision, not just who has the loudest voice. Stakeholder mapping means identifying which groups will benefit, which groups will carry operational burden, which groups will face risk exposure, and which groups must provide evidence or compliance support. For example, a new system might benefit a business unit, but it might increase burden on operations and security if it introduces new integrations and monitoring needs. If governance engages only the business sponsor and ignores operational stakeholders, the decision may look good on paper but fail in practice. Engagement must therefore include the people who will operate and support the outcome, not only the people who request it. This does not mean every decision requires every stakeholder. It means the enterprise should not ignore impact. Stakeholder mapping also helps avoid unintended consequences, such as approving a change that improves one metric while worsening another critical outcome like reliability or data quality. Beginners can use a simple question to guide this. Who will be responsible for living with this decision after the excitement of launch is over? Those are the stakeholders whose input is essential for sustainable governance. This kind of reasoning is often rewarded on the exam because it reflects real governance maturity. Engagement must also be designed to create commitment, not only input, because shared ownership requires stakeholders to support the decision after it is made. Commitment is built when stakeholders feel heard, when the decision criteria are transparent, and when the rationale is explainable. It is also built when governance is consistent, meaning stakeholders see similar decisions handled similarly and exceptions handled through legitimate processes rather than favoritism. Commitment does not require that everyone agrees, but it does require that the process is trusted enough that people accept the outcome as legitimate. Governance can strengthen commitment by clarifying what follow-through will occur, such as what measures will be monitored, what remediation actions will be taken, and who owns what outcomes. When stakeholders see follow-through, they learn that governance decisions are real and not just talk. Beginners sometimes think commitment comes from persuasion speeches, but in governance, it comes from process integrity and consistent behavior. Engagement is the front end of that integrity because it shapes whether people perceive governance as fair and competent. When stakeholders commit, governance choices are supported consistently even when pressure rises. A practical engagement tool is structured consultation, which means gathering input in a way that is efficient, consistent, and focused on the decision criteria. Structured consultation avoids open-ended debate by asking stakeholders to provide input in categories that match governance criteria, such as expected outcomes, risk impacts, dependencies, and operational readiness. This keeps engagement productive and prevents it from becoming a competition of opinions. It also makes input easier to compare, because stakeholders are responding to the same questions rather than offering unrelated concerns. Structured consultation can also reveal conflicts early, such as when one stakeholder expects speed while another expects strict control, allowing governance to address the trade-off explicitly. For beginners, the key idea is that engagement should improve decision quality without collapsing into endless discussion. Structure is what makes that possible because it focuses attention on what matters and ensures the decision can still be made on time. When governance uses structured consultation, it can demonstrate that stakeholder input was considered, even if the final decision chooses one trade-off over another. This increases trust and reduces resistance. In exam scenarios where stakeholders disagree, structured engagement that clarifies trade-offs is often part of the right governance response. Another important engagement skill is managing conflict and escalation ethically, because stakeholder engagement often reveals competing priorities that must be resolved. Governance should not pretend conflicts do not exist, because unresolved conflict produces silent sabotage and bypass behavior. Instead, governance should create a legitimate path for escalation when stakeholders cannot agree, ensuring decisions move to the right authority level. Engagement supports this by surfacing conflict clearly and by documenting the trade-off decision so it is transparent and owned. Ethical engagement also means avoiding favoritism, ensuring that stakeholders with less organizational power still have their impacts considered, especially when decisions affect customers or compliance obligations. It also means creating an environment where stakeholders can raise risks without fear of being blamed for slowing progress, because governance depends on honest information. Beginners sometimes interpret escalation as failure, but escalation is often a sign of healthy governance because it means high-impact trade-offs are being decided by appropriate authority rather than being forced locally. Engagement makes escalation smoother because the issue is framed clearly and stakeholders understand how the decision will be made. When exam scenarios involve unresolved tension and informal workarounds, strengthening engagement and escalation paths is often the key to restoring governance legitimacy. Shared ownership also requires engagement and accountability, because stakeholders must not only help decide, but also help execute and sustain outcomes. Governance engagement should therefore include clear agreements about who owns benefits, who owns service performance, who owns risk mitigation, and who owns evidence practices. When accountability is not discussed openly, stakeholders may support a decision initially, but later disengage when work becomes difficult, claiming it was someone else's responsibility. Engagement that creates shared ownership clarifies responsibilities up front, so stakeholders understand what they are committing to. This is especially important for benefit realization, because benefits often require business process change and adoption that only business stakeholders can drive. It is also important for information governance, because data meaning and quality require business ownership as well as technical stewardship. Beginners often assume governance accountability is an IT responsibility, but mature governance distributes accountability to match outcomes, and engagement is how those assignments become legitimate. When stakeholders participate in defining accountability, they are more likely to accept it and follow through. This reduces the need for constant enforcement because accountability becomes part of the shared governance culture. Communication and transparency are continuous parts of engagement, because engagement is not complete when a meeting ends and a decision is recorded. Stakeholders need to know what was decided, why it was decided, what trade-offs were made, and what follow-through will occur, so they can support governance choices consistently. Transparency also includes reporting progress on governance outcomes, such as benefit realization performance and risk remediation status, because stakeholders lose trust when decisions disappear into silence. Engagement also benefits from feedback channels, where stakeholders can report problems with governance usability, such as bottlenecks or unclear criteria, without turning every complaint into a crisis. This feedback is valuable because governance must be usable to be used, and stakeholders are often the first to notice where processes create friction that encourages bypass behavior. Beginners sometimes think feedback undermines authority, but in governance, feedback strengthens authority by helping the system improve and by showing that governance listens and adapts. Transparent communication also supports fairness because stakeholders can see consistent application of rules and consistent handling of exceptions. Over time, this transparency builds a culture where governance feels like shared ownership rather than central control. A common beginner misconception is that stakeholder engagement means seeking consensus, and that governance is successful only when everyone agrees. In real governance, agreement is often impossible because enterprise trade-offs are real and different stakeholders represent different legitimate interests. The goal of engagement is not unanimous agreement. It is informed decision-making, legitimate trade-off resolution, and committed follow-through. Governance must therefore be designed to engage stakeholders without being captured by endless debate. Another misconception is that engagement is only needed when launching governance. But engagement is needed continuously because stakeholders change, priorities change, and new risks emerge. A third misconception is that engagement is soft and optional. While controls and policies are hard and real, but engagement is part of control effectiveness because it shapes adherence and reduces bypass behavior. Beginners should also recognize that engagement can fail when leaders treat it as a performance, because stakeholders quickly notice when input is requested but ignored without explanation. Effective engagement requires honesty about decision criteria and about who has authority to decide. When you avoid these misconceptions, you can design engagement that produces shared ownership without sacrificing decision speed and accountability. To close, running stakeholder engagement that turns governance into shared ownership means designing a consistent, transparent way for affected groups to provide meaningful input, understand trade-offs, accept accountability, and support governance decisions even under pressure. Stakeholders include business, IT, risk, compliance, operations, finance, and user-facing teams, and shared ownership means governance outcomes are treated as collective responsibilities with clear decision rights and clear follow-through. Effective engagement improves decision quality by bringing the right information into decisions early, and it builds commitment by making criteria and rationale transparent and fair. Structured consultation keeps engagement efficient, escalation paths resolve conflicts legitimately, and accountability agreements ensure that decisions translate into action and measurable outcomes. Continuous communication and feedback maintain trust and usability, so governance becomes the default rather than a rule people bypass. When engagement is run well, governance is no longer something one group enforces. It becomes a shared enterprise discipline that stakeholders defend because they understand its value and see themselves as owners of the outcomes.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.